Christian circles, we hear the word salvation all the time. But I wonder how many of us really understand what it means. What is salvation all about? If someone were to ask you for a definition, what would you say? Well, if you're part of the 74% of Americans who self-identify as Christians, you would most likely answer that salvation is about getting to heaven after we die, and that it comes through the forgiveness of sins. Perhaps a classic example of this thinking is summed up in a little phrase that I see everywhere, on bumper stickers and posters and greeting cards. I once saw it on a Precious Moments figurine of this cute, wide-eyed little boy who looked like he had just done something naughty. And the caption below read, "Christians aren't perfect, just forgiven." Well, I certainly agree that Christians aren't perfect. And I'm thankful that Christians are forgiven. But is that what that slogan implies? Unfortunately not. What it really conveys is that forgiveness alone is what Christianity is about. That forgiveness is the key element in salvation. And that if one can somehow do or say the right thing, we will be given a get-out-of-hell-free card. You know, most of us believe salvation is about meeting certain conditions in order to go to heaven. That our salvation is based on a deal that God the Father made with God the Son about how people could be made right with Him. And that our part is to say yes to God's invitation to eternal life. And that when we do that, some kind of mystical thing happens in heaven, and we're given a deed to a future home after we die. You know, that's about as far as salvation goes for most of us. An eternal insurance policy. Something we can count on taking care of us when we die. But you know, in that way of thinking, salvation becomes kind of like a barcode, doesn't it? You know how those work. Whatever's scanned in is what the computer recognizes the thing as. Doesn't matter what it really is, it's just whatever it scans as. And I can't help but thinking a lot of us look at salvation that way, that we can somehow say or do something that will get us the right barcode for when we die. And we get to live whatever kind of life we choose to live in our, not perfect, just forgiven way of thinking. And then we're off to heaven. Which perhaps partly explains all the statistics that show that there's virtually no difference between those who say they're Christians and those who identify as non-believers when it comes to divorce rate, crime stats, the addiction numbers, any of this stuff. And I hear these kind of statistics and I can't help but wondering if it's possible that we've just totally misunderstood what salvation is all about. Because isn't it true, most of us hear the word salvation and we think ticket to heaven? But what if salvation is something altogether different than that? Perhaps we should start with the simple word that Jesus most often used for salvation. And it was a word that his disciples picked up on, a word that became the most used in the New Testament for salvation. Little Greek word Zoe, which means life. This is what Jesus was talking about with Nicodemus when he told him he had to have a new birth from above. He had to have new life. Or in the Sermon on the Mount when Jesus talks about the broad road that leads to destruction and the narrow that leads to life. Or in John 10 where Jesus said that he came that we might have life and life to its fullest. No, when we look in the words of Jesus, we find that he is constantly substituting the word life for salvation. And then when we read what his disciples wrote, we see that they did the same thing. One of my favorites is 1 John 5:11, which says that God has given us eternal life, and this life is in his Son. He who has the Son has life. He who does not have the Son does not have life. Time and again, the Apostle John talking about life as salvation. Salvation is life. The Apostle Paul, when he was writing to the church in Ephesus, said that because of his great love for us, God who is rich in mercy made us alive with Christ even when we were dead in transgressions. It's by grace that you've been saved. So, why am I going with all of these passages? I wanted to just say a few of them in a row so that we would realize that the message of Jesus and the message of his early disciples was not so much focused on the forgiveness of sin as it was focused on newness of life. Now, that, of course, involves the forgiveness of sin, right? We're not trying to discount the forgiveness of sin in any way. but just to put it in its proper perspective. Because when it comes to eternal life, the forgiveness of sin is just a small part of it. You see, the larger part is about walking through life's ups and downs with Jesus. I like the way Colossians 1:13 describes salvation as God rescuing us from the dominion of darkness and bringing us into the kingdom of his Son. I love that verse because it's written in the present tense, which is to say, it's not about pie in the sky by and by when we die. It's about something that happens at the moment that we put our faith in Jesus. We are instantly provided a home in the kingdom of heaven. And that's what salvation is in its fullest sense. It's living each day in tune with the rhythms of the life that God created us for. It's living out 1 Thessalonians 5 verses 16 and 17 by always being joyful, constantly praying, and giving thanks in all circumstances. This is what connects our life to our salvation. Our life becomes an outworking of the life that God placed in us. And when we limit the meaning of salvation merely to the forgiveness of sins, we're never going to make sense of what our lives have to do with our salvation. It's only when we see this connection between salvation and what happens in our day-to-day life that we're going to begin to understand that salvation is not so much about the future as it's about our life now, today. And you know, when we look to the scriptures, we see it's always been that way. The one characteristic of all those who truly believed in God was their belief that salvation was about life in the here and now. When Abraham left home to follow the promise of God, Abraham believed in a God who was involved in his life today, involved in every decision. And if you look, you'll find the same is true of Moses and David and Daniel and all the rest. When we define salvation merely in terms of accepting an arrangement that God the Father made with God the Son that involved a cross, we totally miss what salvation is about. Because the real issue with God is whether we're alive to him or dead to him. That's so important. Let me say that again. The real issue with God is whether we're alive to him or dead to him. Or, said another way, do we have an interactive relationship with him that constitutes a new kind of life, a life that Jesus described as being from above? Do we have confidence in him in every dimension of our daily life? Do we believe that he's right about everything and adequate to take care of anything? You know, I love the definition that Jesus gives us of eternal life in John chapter 17. He's praying to God the Father, and in verse 3 he says this. He says, "This is eternal life, that my disciples may know you, the only real God, and Jesus Christ whom you've sent." Now, this may sound like Jesus is talking about simple head knowledge. But notice that Jesus is not saying that eternal life comes by knowing about God or learning about God. What he says is eternal life is about actually knowing God personally. Jesus used the word know, K-N-O-W, in a way that refers to something intimate and something personal. Thus we find in passages like Amos chapter 3 and verse 2, God says to Israel, "You're the only ones I have known from among all the families of the earth." Now, obviously God knew about the other families on earth, but he did not know them in the sense of having a personal relationship with them. Or what about Mary, Jesus' mom? You remember when the angel came to her and told her she was going to bear a child, she was totally confused. And remember the question she asked? She said, "How can this be, since I know no man?" Well, Mary knew about men, but she had not yet known a man in the sense of becoming intimate. And that's what this word is about. And that's what this image of eternal life that Jesus holds before us is about. Jesus is not telling us that we need to get more knowledge about God. What he's saying is we need to develop an intimate, interactive relationship with him.